Good morning to those who are joining us on the west coast of the US. Good afternoon to all of those of you in the middle of the world. And good evening from Utrecht, which is a place in the middle of the Netherlands. Today, our theme is going to be about making good propaganda, but I think it's going to involve a lot of looking at what the current techniques are around propaganda. It's going to try and understand how we can use these techniques in the work that we're doing as civil society, and if there's ways that we can understand the tactic so that we can do better at our communication in trying to fight these tactics and some of these choices that are being made. So the theme of today is called How to Make Good Propaganda. A little bit about myself. My name is Brandon. I'm the director of the RNTC, which is the Radio Netherlands Training Center. We're based in the Netherlands, and we've been training media professionals on how to make or how to master media for the last 50 years. A lot of the stuff that we do is linked to persuasive storytelling and how to create positive social behavior change. So we do this in platforms around the world, linking young people and civil society in behavior change. We have a learning by doing approach, so I'm going to try and make this webinar as interactive as possible, even though we've got a lot of distance and space between us. Let's come to this with an open mind and wanting to explore, and I'm going to try and involve you where I can. So let's kick off. I think the academic in me always wants to understand what the thing is first that we're exploring. So a good kickoff for me is, what is propaganda? A definition that I'm proposing could be that propaganda is the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purposes of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. I think it's also important to see that there's two parts of this. You could use it to help an institution, or you can cause people harm. You can also help people if you understand propaganda. Propaganda is mainly spread through the media. So when we're looking at propaganda techniques, we're really looking at how this can be used in a media context, or how it can be used to appeal to a big group of people. If you have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat. And as I go along, I will check in with Maya, just in terms of our process, to see if there are any questions coming up. Maya, if there is an important question, could you just raise your hand visually so I can see, and then I'll try and address it as well. Okay? So can we agree to this definition of propaganda? I think it's pretty straightforward. It's just somebody with an aim, a very clear aim, using the media or using a platform to spread this, and it usually has a very specific purpose. So if you're thinking about your communication as a civil society member or a person who's in charge of the communication, are you thinking about your specific aims as clearly as a propagandist? Do you have a very clear vision of what your communication is trying to do? I think for most propagandists, it's true that they have got a very specific target that they're trying to reach. Do you have the same target in mind? And I'm coming from a civil society organization myself. I know that we like to be really inclusive and include all of our stakeholders and take them along on this journey with us, which often means that we're communicating in very different directions without clear aims. Propaganda, on the other hand, has a very clear aim, and it seeks to spread an idea, give a specific piece of information or rumor with a very specific purpose. If we take a look at some of the big things that are happening across Europe, I mean, Brexit is a European talking point at the moment, the migration and refugee crisis. Donald Trump and the Trump phenomenon, as well as things like the far right rising? What about things like economic downturns and hardships and climate change? These are all things that are happening on our continent, amongst others. What are some of the challenges that your organization is facing, that you're trying to rally people around? I want you to think about that for a second. What is the cause that you want to create propaganda about? And perhaps you can put this in the chat bar for a second. What is your big theme? Or what is your big mission that you are going to be tackling with this propaganda? Because if I look at all of these themes, what I notice is that the propaganda that we're seeing across Europe is highly linked to these themes. So you might have a different theme that I haven't got on the board. If there are, let me know. Maya, what have we got on our board so far?
Nothing so far, but people might be writing still.
Okay.
So maybe just give them, Seema wrote, access to donated and discounted technology for nonprofits.
Okay, so you want to communicate.
Which is TechSoup's mission, yeah.
Which is TechSoup's mission. So you want to communicate this in a much stronger way. You want to use the techniques of propaganda to get this across, okay? Anybody else?
Not yet.
Perhaps I could also ask.
Oh, there's one. Funding for community groups for local development.
Okay. So the behavior that we're seeing is that that people aren't donating, or donors aren't funding local civil society groups. What is the problem? And where is it directed to? So I want you to think about this as we go. Who are we going to be speaking to as we develop our propaganda? What we notice when you look at these themes and the people that have been targeted by these very specific campaigns, we're going to be looking at them as we go along, is that the communicators, the propagandists who are speaking in this space know their target audiences and what drives them. So when we look at Brexit, for instance, the people who are behind the Brexit campaigns, the propaganda around Brexit, knew exactly how and which buttons to push to move their audience to behavior change. For us, in the civil society space, we're very lucky because we've got an immediate connection a lot of the times with the people that we're trying to serve, with the people that we're trying to communicate to. So if I ask you, what do you know about your target audience? You can tell me a lot. So already we've got a tool in our kit that we can start using for some social change. We understand our target audiences, or the people that we want to affect change with. What else do we have on our list? I'll take one more.
We have awareness on the threat of fake news around EU parliamentary elections, yeah.
Okay, so there are EU parliamentary elections coming up. And what the fake news spread specifically, I think this might be coming from Romania, if I'm right or no. This was a question from one of the participants from Romania specifically, was that there's been a lot of fake news spread about the candidates, and are they corrupt? Are these candidates the right representatives for us? Some of those questions might be valid, but what else is being communicated in that space? So knowing the target audience is our first step. What is happening in our society that we want to change? We want to tackle a certain topic. And what is it that my target audience believes about this? If we think about Brexit, what were some of the driving forces that the propaganda used in Brexit? It understood that British people felt that they were superior to Europe, or thought that Europe was draining funds and money from Britain because Britain's economy was superior. So if you poke at that, that's how you can develop your propaganda. Similarly, the migrant and refugee crisis that we're seeing in Europe has got a lot of contention around it. There are people on either sides of this fence. And if you know what your target audience are thinking about the migrant crisis, you can either change that belief or you could make it stronger, that the migrants are coming to harm us, which is some of the propaganda that we're seeing specifically from the Breitbart side of things. I'm going to move on to the next slide. How does it work? How do we go from thinking about a concept to actually taking action? Propaganda, in a lot of times, is linked to creating action. I want you to vote in a certain way. I want you to do a certain activity, or I want you to change a certain belief in yourself. So this is a pretty standard pathway of changing beliefs, a radicalization pathway, where we take somebody from an opinion, a belief, or a feeling, and we move them to more and more extremes. The biggest being terrorism. If we look at where things lie on this map, activism is a part of it. So what are you asking your groups, what are you asking people to do with your propaganda? Are you asking them to form new opinions, beliefs, or feelings? Or are you asking them to do something? Or are you asking them to protest in a certain way, or break the rules of what is accepted in the society? So when you start thinking about your propaganda, you also might want to think, where are we taking people in a radicalization? Are we taking people along a radicalization pathway? Are we moving them to some sort of action? And what is that action? And is that action an ethical action? In most propaganda, we see that the action is not always ethical. We'll get to it when we come to ideology and building an ideology. But the example I always use is PETA. Most people think that protection of animals is a good thing. You don't want your products tested on animals. You don't want to see people abusing animals. So most people already have that opinion. What if you go online and you start engaging in a discussion? You see a video that suddenly shows you the slaughterhouses of Australia, where people are abusing sheep and taking pleasure in butchering these animals. You start to move in your thinking or your feelings. Your feelings get a bit stronger. Then Peter sends, at the end of the video, there's a message that says, if you want to help us and our work, sign this petition. You sign this petition. You're starting at the activism, you're starting in activism. Now, Peter has got you in their mailing list, and they say, well, all the people in Australia who were affected by this, who signed this petition, come and show your strength in numbers. And we start activism, and we're going to march through the streets, and we're going to show our disapproval for what has been done. So you can see that the process of moving from an opinion and having a belief in things is not so difficult. People go on these steps quite quickly in some cases. Here is a better example of it, where most people have probably seen this game. It's called Snakes and Ladders or Chutes and Ladders, where you come to the board and you're ready to play, and you're going to start engaging in a certain topic. And you see things that make your opinions quite strong, or you are exposed to ideas that bring you down in your radicalization or your activism or your awareness. And for a lot of times, people spend their lives on the board going up and down. This is a kind of what we want in work that is specifically against certain propaganda techniques. Our actions are not going to stop violent extremism, but they might just bring people down a notch So you're not thinking in radical terms, you're just going to be brought down. The heat is going to be brought down slowly, more and more. In the work that we've been doing with countering ISIS and the propaganda of ISIS, what we found was that people stayed on this board for a very long time. And some things made them really radical and some things brought them down. ISIS was really effective because their messaging was so good and so clear, understood their audiences well, that they could communicate in ways that brought them up the ladder very quickly and up the chart very, very quickly. And it was also because they were at a lot of the times the only people communicating in that space. So because ISIS were the only people speaking, that was the only message that they were hearing all the way up this ladder of radicalization towards extremism and terrorism. So your job in creating good propaganda could also be to keep people in the middle of the map, to not let them go to an extremist route. So sometimes it might not be obvious that you're doing good work because, well, people aren't blowing things up, or some people aren't voting in radical trajectories like the far right or the far left, but they're staying in the middle somewhere and they're forming a very gray ideology. That's okay in a lot of the work that we do. So we try and bring the heat down to a nice a space where people still have interests and opinions and can still be activists, but we don't take them to the extremes. At this point, are there any questions? And I'm looking to Maya. As we go along, if you have a question, if something is unclear, or I need to explain something a bit clearer, please let me know. And you can just type it in, I'm not getting this, or help with this very specific concept, and I will go backwards a little bit. I'm trying not to make this a broadcast, so please interject as much as possible. I know it's kind of hard when there's a giant head on your screen talking at you. But let's move on. So as we progress, I'm going to add a new concept, and then we're going to test this concept out. So if we take a look at radicalization, at building polarities, at building propaganda, what's important that we see is that there's a specific worldview. And this view is an ideology that's constructed for this propagandist to keep on telling their story from. So in civil society, we often call it the mission or the vision of the organization. What's your vision? What's your mission? What do you want to try and achieve? Sometimes you could even do it by campaign. So this campaign's vision and mission is to try and convince Romanians that voting in the EU election is vital for Romania's visibility in the EU, because currently people don't believe that this is an important role. So that might be your mission. It's to raise awareness amongst people in Romania about voting in the EU election. So let's take a look at some propaganda techniques, and we're going to go step by step. The first one is creating an ideology. Now, as I was saying, this is like your vision and mission, but another way to explain this could be your story. What is the story that you're going to tell people in your campaigns or in your communication? What is the ideology that they're going to hook into? Propaganda is exceptionally good at ideology. And what does an ideology consist of? An ideology contains 6 basic arguments or beliefs. One is that it gives you a feeling of criticizing injustice. You're frustrated, you have outrage, this is a good place to vent, or we understand your outrage, we understand your injustice. this doesn't have to be a bad thing. Again, thinking about your audience and knowing your audience, understanding your audience, what are some of the injustices they face? What are some of the things that they identify as feelings that they currently have? Great counter campaigns or propaganda has those feelings encoded in them. I know how you feel. It's terrible, isn't it? Feeling like you have no say in the European Union. And when messages start like that, immediately you as a viewer or a listener or a participant go, yes, they know me, they understand my concern. So this is a technique that we can use as well, understanding what the feelings are of our audiences. The next thing is, what is the collective enemy? In propaganda, we have a very clear sense of us versus them. If you think of what is happening across Eastern Europe, there is the sense that certain donor groups are coming in to influence governments, and they're spending money in these governments to try and influence and change the courses of government, messing with the autonomy of the countries that this donor operates in. That feels like a collective enemy. The collective enemy are Western-based funders and donors of NGOs. Whereas we, the good people, the governments, the autonomous people, are just trying to do what's good for our citizens. And they are trying to impose on us values that don't belong here. So that already creates an us and them. Think about your work. I know that it feels weird to appoint an enemy, but what is the enemy of your organization? Is it slavery? For instance, there's a great chocolate company in Amsterdam, and the chocolate company's name is Tony's Choconelli. And they have appointed their enemy as people who employ slave labor. And what this means is there are people in the world, chocolate manufacturers in the world, that use people at such low income rates that they're almost slaves in their production cycle. So Tony's wants to change that. So their collective enemy are farmers who source labor from people who and don't pay good salaries for them. So how can we use a collective enemy idea in the communication that we have? It's an us versus them. The other thing here is that this enemy needs to feel that it needs to activate our feelings of hatred or a desire for revenge. When we look at ideology, we're creating that this is good and that is bad. If you eat chocolate from anywhere else that isn't a place that has sourced it from good, honest farmers that have been paid a decent wage, then you are a bad person. I see a hand. Maya, tell me.
Yes, my hand represents Marta's question.
Yeah.
What about if it's about the collective enemy? What if you can't point to one concrete enemy? Do you just make it up a bit?
So here's the thing. We have truth on our side. And a lot of the times, these ideologies are fabricated. And it's fabricated, created by prejudices, etc. In terms of a collective enemy, who does your audience point to? Or what does the messaging point to that you're trying to fight against? If the message is saying, hey, government is good and you should trust the Russian government, and everybody who's not in support is not doing the best for the country, then who is your collective enemy? It also depends on what messages you're hearing and what people believe. If people believe that the EU as an institution doesn't benefit them, and therefore voting for an EU representative in the EU Parliament is a waste of time, then you've got to show that the EU is actually really good, and that anybody who's telling you that the EU is not valuable is your enemy. So can you see how I framed it here? It's trying to find someone to separate yourself from. So when you hear that message, hey, you shouldn't vote in the EU election, immediately your brain is activated and you go, wait, I've heard that this person is a bad person, and maybe I should be a little bit more objective in my opinion. A lot of times that shortcut, that kind of good, bad, evil, holy, are important for us to understand concepts. Think about your favorite childhood stories. They're very clear cut. There's a good guy and a bad guy. And there's the good guy does X, the bad guy does Y. And if you want to be like the good guy, here's a path. If you want to be like the bad guy, here's the path. So we need to find somebody or something that will be our bad guy. And this could be one of the feelings that people have, like the injustice to poverty, or the frustration that they feel about traffic on their daily commute, and who represents that. If we also think about this idea of good versus bad, we start to think about positive social identities. We want to create people, we want to give people and their new behavior a good identity. So if I were not to vote in an election that would be important for my country, what am I doing? I am not taking part. I am not honoring a legacy of people who fought to get me a vote. So I'm letting down my ancestors, or I'm letting down the brave people who fought for my freedom to vote. And when you start to say it like that, I devalue your inaction, because look at all the great people who've been so active up until now, and you're going to ignore all of that and do nothing. Versus look at these people who are voting, who are continuing that struggle towards freedom and independence. And I use this example because this is very much how it's framed in my home country of South Africa. If you don't vote, you're abandoning the struggle that people before you have fought for. If you do vote, and South Africans vote on voting day en masse, it's because you're continuing to show your support for the institution of democracy and the values that it has. So again, that propaganda technique of devaluating a certain behavior, or giving the desired behavior a much bigger positive social identity is important. We're going to take a look at a campaign where this makes sense, but I'm going to continue the last two. In violent extremism, violence is the only legitimate way out as an effective method to reach a goal. And this is not always something that we can do, and we shouldn't do as civil society. But this is something that we see over and over in propaganda messages, that if you are unhappy, take a gun, go to the streets, or do something violent. We don't want to promote that, because we would also like to keep within the legal parameters. The last one is predict a future state and a reached goal. So if you vote in the upcoming election, what does the future state look like? It's utopia, or you have a voice. Even if it's not the outcome that you chose, your decision is important, because 10 votes equals 1 seat in parliament, or 50 votes equals 1 seat, whatever. You can do the mathematics around it. But if you do this, it will lead to this, and this is what the future will look like for us all. If you're paying attention, or if you have any background in marketing, you'll notice that this ideology, or the way that I'm describing it also sounds like very good advertising. And that's true. Advertising, marketing, propaganda, they share a similar thing because they're all trying to convince you to change your behavior. And the techniques and the tools that they use are there to get you to move to a new behavior, a new positive identity. If you buy a BMW, you will be seen as rich and powerful, and friends and women will desire you. We go from a bad social image. You don't have a BMW, nobody is going to like you. You have a BMW, people are going to like you, value you, and appreciate you. And similarly, good things will happen. So an ideology is that. What is the story that you're going to be telling about your organization? What is the story that you're going to be telling about what you want to do? This is your ideology. This is your utopian plan that you want to achieve through the communication that you have. So I've got a video that I want to play, and I hope that the lag won't be bad. But this was a piece of propaganda about Brexit, and it was created by the UKIP, in 2016, right as the Brits were going to elections. And I want you to try and see how many of the things can you identify: injustice, a collective enemy, a stereotype, positive social identities, and this is the only way. Like, there is no other way. This is the only way forward. So let's take a look.
Attention. This is a European Union regulated free-range chicken farm. Thank you.
There's nothing to stop us leaving, is there?
No, nothing at all. You go first.
Attention. You are safer and stronger inside.
I'm not scared. Let's take a look. No good, it's raining.
What? Shame. It looks so nice out there in the sunshine.
You go out there, they won't let you back in. It'll get wet and cold and dark, and you won't get your dose of fish meal. Hey, look! Corn! There's corn out there and birds are eating it!
I'm walking in the rain. Every patter speaks your name.
You know what? I don't care. I'll sing in the rain.
No! Oh, no! It's not safe out there. Come back!
Look! It's not raining! I'm free! Come on!
Oh, I'm coming too. I'm coming with you.
Come back, safer and stronger chickens.
So we all know how that turned out. The important thing is, if we try and look at this ideology landscape, this is true of everything. If you're looking at the Trump campaign, if you're looking at the way that Russia communicates around certain issues, if we're looking even at Brexit, an ideology is created. So if we look at number one, to identify and criticize injustice, what was the injustice that was created? What is the collective enemy? What is the stereotype? And the positive social identity. If we look at the first one, what is the injustice? Inside the EU, it's dark, it's miserable, and it's wet. The collective enemy are these oppressive EU chicken keepers who have lots of regulations. And there's a stereotype about them. the EU figure was dark and mysterious and devious, and looked like the bad guy from every James Bond movie. And then there was the positive social identity. The positive social identity was, if you leave, look at how beautiful it is outside. It's green and there's corn and the birds are happy. And if we leave, it will be rainy for a little bit, but then it will be good and we will live in the sunshine and not in this oppressive, dark confinement. So this is how that ideology was created. But more impressive, I think, with this piece of propaganda is that they really understood what people thought of the EU, that it was imprisoning and it had all of these rules and regulations, and being inside, we're just another chicken. But if we exit, we can be leaders. We can show the others the way. So the ideology here is very clear. The next step is to build binaries. Propaganda is powerful because it's really simple. And I think we complicate our messages too much. We want to say so much and we want to give people all this information, and there's just so much to tackle, when we should actually be simplifying our messages even more. Propaganda uses messages, and the message is again conforming to that idea of good and evil. It's a bipolar worldview, binaries, dark and light, good, bad. But this is not always negative. If you think about your favorite movies that you've ever watched or your favorite campaigns, they always start with a negative that leads to a positive. If you are creating any sort of messaging or any sort of campaign that you're going to be tackling, specifically if there's a campaign already, you're going to have to form a part of a binary. If someone is saying the EU is bad, then you've got to come back and say that the EU is good, or the EU is positive in these reasons, or why the EU is positive. So oftentimes binaries exist. I love this one of Trump over here, because it's very clear as well that Trump speaks in binaries. This is good, that is bad. And this brings us to our next campaign. I'm looking at this political advertisement, and this was one of the election 2016 campaigns that were done in battleground states in the US. And I want you to pay attention to the language and how often that language is repeated. So see if you can count how many binary concepts you can find in this.
In Hillary Clinton's America, the system stays rigged against Americans. Syrian refugees flood in. Illegal immigrants convicted of committing crimes get to stay, collecting Social Security benefits, skipping the line. Our border open, it's more of the same, but worse. Donald Trump's America is secure. Terrorists and dangerous criminals kept out. The border secure. Our families safe. Change that makes America safe again. Donald Trump for president.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
And we all know how that turned out. The reason why I like these campaigns is because they're so very clear. And you think that this is difficult, but it really isn't. Look at the way these things are being communicated. If our borders are open under bored and inactive Hillary, under President Trump, they're going to be safe and secure and closed. So that binary worldview is important. Think about your binaries for a second. What are your campaign binaries? What is the good versus bad in your own campaigns or your own messaging? Do any of you have an example where you can point, hey, this is how I want to use a binary in your own campaigns or your own messaging? I'll give you a second to type those out in the message. So I think another important thing to understand is that humans communicate in binary, and we create this shortcut. And we've got these stereotypes that we have already. Propaganda is good at understanding that stereotypes exist, and bad propaganda supports a stereotype and creates a deepening of a stereotype. Good propaganda can break through stereotypes or break through by understanding what it is that people already feel. So it's a starting point and not the end point. Most propaganda seeks to create stereotypes and make them stronger. But if you understand the stereotype at the beginning of your campaign and go, this is something that's wrong in our community. We all think that the EU is bad. And by acknowledging it, we understand that this stereotype exists and that people have this belief or have this idea already. What we then want to do is start there and move them to a new thing. You believe this, but this is people who believe this look like this, and they're slightly stupid and backwards and are hoping to bring back this kind of regime or this kind of ideology. But by leaving that bad stereotype behind, you show that you are awoken, or in popular terms, woke is the new thing of breaking through stereotypes. If we also want to talk about breaking through stereotypes, filter bubbles and clusters or echo chambers often repeat the same stereotypes over and over and over again. So if you talk to people with hardline religious views, they might repeat old mantras or old shortcut stereotypes. Or if you want to address the alt-right or alt-left, like the extremes of each side, and you question their behaviors or their beliefs, they'll often present you a stereotype to block so that they don't have to deal with the thought process. But if you present that stereotype to them and say that we understand you, you can shortcut the way that you can communicate, because now you're not confronted with a wall, you're confronted with shared understanding that then you're going to bring across. So understanding, again, going back to that first idea, understanding your target audience and understanding that these shortcuts exist there already. By taking those shortcuts and using them in your campaign as a negative and then moving them to a new positive identity, I think is a way to break through echo chambers and filter bubbles. A good example is that recently there's been a Gillette ad, and Gillette is focused on toxic masculinity, which is an interesting concept for a razor blade advert, a razor blade company that for years and years supported toxic masculinity. But if you go and watch that campaign, that's exactly how they start. For years and years, we were toxic masculinity. And they show men breaking through and being very toxic in the way that they approach things, and what the kind of behavior is that they mean by toxic behavior. And then they show the perceived future state, people standing up against bullying, people being better fathers to their sons, and people not allowing sexual advances by men to women that are untoward. These are all concepts that they first understand the stereotype, and they repeat the stereotype often throughout the ad. Boys will be boys, for instance, is repeated. And then at the end, why can't we make better men? Why is the best a man can get rather not be the best a man can be? So they're changing perception, they're changing an outlook. And we can use that same trick and the same toolkit. That's a positive message that's been used. And in terms of how well it was received, that had a lot of views and traction and discussion and a lot of arguments specifically in the male community about, am I toxic, am I not? So it did its job. The last thing I want to leave you with, because I'm also aware that we're running out of time slightly, is to play on emotion. Propaganda is powerful because it's emotional. It incites hatred, it incites fear, it builds segregation, and it gives people superiority and empowerment as a goal. You can have empowerment and superiority from a moral perspective as well. I can be morally superior because I'm taking action and being involved in the democracy of my country by voting. I am doing the right thing. I am questioning the status quo. And because of that, I am woke, or I am I am functioning at a higher level than all the sheep that obey. So you can also encode playing on emotion in your messaging. And it's vitally important. In a lot of the space for disinformation, for instance, the way that people have responded in the disinformation space is by going, well, these are the facts. Fact, 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 fact. Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, etc., are communicating with such charisma, with a lot of emotion, with rallying cries of, we will protect you, we will secure you, you will be safe in my great America, versus how we're communicating. Well, since President Trump has come in, fact, fact, fact. That has no emotion. So we're fighting something really powerful with a blunt instrument. I'm not saying that you can't have facts, and I'm not saying that your information is not important. What I'm saying is we keep our messages short, we use emotion. We have a particular point of view that we're trying to address. And that point of view needs to be clear to your audience. So a good starting point for propaganda is that it needs to be highly emotional, simple, and it needs to be something that people recognize immediately. If they're in a specific echo chamber or they're in a specific way of thinking already, emotion is going to drag them out of it. Think about how affected you were about the Syrian migrant crisis up until, I want to say, April 2017. The migrant crisis was happening all over Europe, but nobody knew it. It was just happening. There were all of these death boats, and yes, it was reported. These are how many people are dying. This is the terrible conditions that are happening from migrants from Syria to Europe. But then there was an emotional piece of messaging, and that emotional piece of messaging was a young boy in a red jumper that had washed up onto shore, and people had taken a photo of this child lying face down in the wave. And that emotional message spread and created awareness around the Syrian refugee crisis. And up until then, we weren't communicating emotionally. The only people who were communicating emotionally were propagandists who were creating fear and hysteria around the concept of the migrants are coming, we need to shut the borders. We need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our identity, because when they come, we're going to lose a piece of ourselves. We're going to lose this European concept and our European values. So emotion is very important. And I think we can communicate much better emotionally as well from a civil society point of view. So taking a look at our ingredients for propaganda, and great propaganda, but you can also call this really good communication. What are your thoughts? What are some of your questions? We've got about 8 minutes left, and I think that should be enough to address some of these questions. So type them in, and Maya, will you do us the honor of telling us all about, or asking some of these questions?
I certainly will. If you please type them up, I'll read them out loud. I just had, while people are writing, I just had a thought about the Gillette ad, because I recently read an article about what you said on knowing your audience. And And actually, one of the analysis actually points out to the kind of witty advertisement point of view and not social change point of view, because Gillette knew that their target audience with this ad are in fact women, because they in majority buy the razors for the men. So in that sense, that ad is not directed to men, but to women who, and that vision, that positive vision of the future of the world is actually for them to see and not to, change toxic masculinity.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's very interesting. And specifically what it's been doing, I sat in a couple of panels specifically about the Gillette ad and what it was communicating and if that message was clear. But it certainly does understand its audience and the perceptions that audience have about masculinity, being man, being a boy. What does that mean?
Yeah, so we have a question from Malta. Would you be able to share with us some successful positive propaganda and why it worked?
Sure. I mean, there's been, I think, a very good place to start would be to go look at the Dove commercials, right? The Dove was trying to reimagine femininity, and they were also looking at how to influence the behavior of women towards self-image. And most women know the Dove ads where the woman sketches her perception of herself versus the perception that other people have of her. That propaganda had quite profound impact. Similarly, there have been a large number of campaigns. I'm just trying to think of an easy example. So across Europe, in the propaganda space, for a long time, ISIS were the only people communicating to certain groups of specifically Muslim youth. In the Netherlands, we had the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg lost about 500 young people to joining ISIS in the period 2013 to 2015. And it was because all the propaganda that was created from ISIS. ISIS was creating around 800 pieces of content a month. And this was directed throughout the world, but there was a focus towards Western Europe. And interventions started happening. Yes, there were on-the-ground interventions, but there were also very specific campaigns targeting Muslim boys. And it was all about keeping them involved in communities and then trying to filter them to community organizations where they could seek assistance. And that propaganda worked very well. We understood that young people felt that they didn't really have a place in society, or they didn't feel like they were involved in some way. So the propaganda that was created pushed young boys to community centers where they could feel more involved in their society and also take part in their society in a more active way. And that's really what ISIS was doing. They were saying, hey, come here and we will give your life purpose. So we used that same message, and instead of saying, go there and do negative things, there's so much that you could do for the Muslims in your community here. And that message really resonated. The results, and I don't want to say that it was all because of the propaganda campaigns, but the result was that in the period directly after that, 2015, midway through 2015 to 2017, one kid went to go and join ISIS through the communication that we saw, that we know of. So I mean, that's quite a clear. It was quite a clear message, and we've tried to replicate this in other territories, and we're busy testing these as well. Other propaganda, I mean, I come from South Africa, and South Africa went through a massive shift in society where there was a lot of distrust and mistrust between racial groups. And a lot of positive propaganda was done post the 1994 elections aimed at young people. And it encoded the same words, the rainbow nation. So yes, we were all separate colors and we were left to develop independently. But then this concept of the Rainbow Nation, people working together in various color categories towards a similar goal, was invented. And if you speak to any South African between the ages of 16 and probably 45 that were young in that period, you will find that they repeat that same message over and over. Oh, what is South Africa? Oh, we're the Rainbow Nation. And it was a behavior change campaign about changing perceptions on racial relations. And it was all propaganda funded by the government.
We have one more from Seema, who's asking, or I guess doubting, can propaganda be unifying, help bringing people together even with an us versus them approach?
Well, it depends who the them is, right? The them could also be the people who still have that previous belief. So I don't want to be one of those guys who still is a toxic masculine man. I want to be perceived as a more a man who is a little bit more woke or is a little bit more socially aware. So I don't want to be a cave person with that old mentality. I want to be a new, independent, smarter human. And that's the us that versus them that we can create. In terms of unity, I don't think so. I don't think that propaganda will unify. Except in the idea of the South African example, people who weren't willing to contribute to the Rainbow Nation, yeah, there were those people. Is everybody in the society your target audience? Is every piece of propaganda aimed at you? No. You're fighting your battles one-to-one, right? So in the same target audience with the same belief, you're going to try and bring them a different message or a new message. Try and leave an old behavior and leave that toxicness behind and go towards a new state. Does that answer your question?
I think we have just one last one kind of, and it relates a little bit to what you said already. But Iliana asks, do you think it's possible to confront your rivals with contra-propaganda, contra to theirs? Or is it much better to develop a different one? So is it about combating what you heard, or developing a new one?
So these are called counter-narratives. There are different kinds. There's counter-narratives and alternate narratives. And counter-narratives are, you say this, I'm going to say this. You said this, I'm going to say this. And what you're always doing is that you're playing catch up to a message. And a lot of the times, the only way to discredit it is to use lots of facts and information. By going, that's not true, this is why. Fact, 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 fact. And eventually you lose your audience. The better approach, or the approach that we're seeing more effective, is creating alternate narratives. So you're communicating this, and that's okay. We're going to say this. This is our own message. It's in a similar wheelhouse, okay? So we're still talking about European elections, but we're going to communicate it from the way that we want to communicate, and we're going to set the agenda. The reason why this is important is because of positive emotion. The people who are communicating and you're trying to catch up to are saying that if you don't vote, that is excellent, or this will show the government and you will be empowered. So what are you going to say? That if you do vote, you're going to undermine the government and therefore you will feel empowered? There's no need to change that behavior. They already feel empowered. What can you offer them that's better? Or what steps can you offer them that provide a different pathway? Going back to the ISIS example, what happened in the early days is that we kept on doing counter propaganda or counter campaigns. So ISIS was saying, come to us and we will make you heroes and we will make you fight for the cause and you will be a part of a brotherhood. What did the West respond with? If you go and fight with ISIS, you should feel guilt and shame. That alternate narrative is really negative. One was super positive, provided a great ideology, and the other ideology kind of made you feel gross and weird. And as a result, those messages were actually supporting this idea of going to go and join ISIS. So in terms of the propaganda, set your own message. Make sure your message and your story is clear. Your own ideology is in place, because that's going to be powerful to communicate from. And if you set that agenda, they will inevitably be drawn to it if it's working. People will be drawn to it and they will want to try and counter it, and they will always be countering from a negative. Yep. Maya, you're on mute.
I know. Do you have time for one, literally last one? This is...
Let's take one more question.
One more and then we go.
Yeah.
Seema asks, what is big data's role in propaganda? Now we can be more granular in how we speak to people. Does this affect the effectiveness of propaganda in terms of having one strong message versus several nuanced messages based on people's interest profiles?
Absolutely. Big data is such a great ally. I want to say that Cambridge Analytica, I'm going to mention that name and just leave it there for a second. Cambridge Analytica took big data and profiled its audiences so specifically that they could target exact messaging. An example of this was in the run-up to the elections in the US. What Cambridge Analytica did was that they targeted female voters who were of color in Florida. And it was a specific part of Florida where people haven't made up their minds. They were swing voters. And what they put in front of them and in their timelines was a message from Hillary Clinton apparently making a racist joke. So instead of getting those people to go out and vote, those people abstained from their vote. And because of their abstention, that specific part of Florida went to the Republicans. And that kind of nuanced targeting makes stereotyping very easy. It makes you understand exactly what your target audience are thinking. It makes you understand the nuanced language that you need to use. Think about that British campaign for Brexit. Think about the accents that were used. If you have any contact with a British person, you would know that that's kind of a working class accent. It's not a very posh British accent. So they nuanced it. If you listen to that chicken a little bit better, you would also understand that he's probably in his late 40s, mid 50s. The primary group that were targeted during the Brexit campaigns were those people. They still had an affinity to the war, the Great War, and British independence, and that we will drink tea, a kind of empire mentality. So they really connected with that, and they really nuanced that community. So data is playing an incredibly big role in this, but it's because it allows us to get closer and closer to our target audience. And that's really where we need to start here, is really understand what our target audience are telling us, because that information is what you hang everything else off of.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brendan. We have to finish now. Brendan, thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants for amazing questions and for showing up this afternoon. And just a technical note, we'll be posting the recording probably at the beginning of next week. I'll post the link on the Megaphone website. I posted the link in the chat. We will be also posting it in the Facebook event. Thank you again so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.